Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Paolo Zannoni, who is an executive at Prada, formerly at Goldman Sachs, also at Fiat, and the author of this book right here, Money and Promises, 7 Deals That Changed the World, which is a work of financial history, history of banking, history of public finance. There's a lot that's packed into this book. Welcome, Paolo.
It's a pleasure to be here, Greg.
Now, I find that you had a very interesting career because it seems like there was a point in your life where you had to make a decision as to whether or not to pursue academia or banking.
Yeah.
And you chose the banking route. I chose the academia route, and I'm not sure if I made the right decision.
Neither am I. But you know, we were facing the same fork in the road.
Yeah.
We just took the two different ways.
But it does seem that even though you pursued a path of professional success, you always had in the back of your mind this curiosity about not only the workings of banking and its place in society, but also kind of the history and the evolution of the practices that you were engaged in. This book, we'll walk through all the different chapters, many of which take place in Italy. And I think it's surprising to a lot of people, given the world today, how important Italy has been historically when it comes to the creation. I mean, I think a lot of people know about Luca Pacioli. I know I learned a lot about him in the past, but there are these other characters, right, in Pisa and in Venice that, and in Naples also, who played huge roles.
Naples
so I was wondering,
a big surprise to me as well.
Yeah, and so while you were practicing as a banker and executive with Fiat, did you do a lot of this research at the time, or did you have to wait until after you had sort of scaled back your professional work to do a lot of this research?
No, it's strange. As you know, I started as a postgraduate at the University of Florence, and then I moved into a PhD program at Yale. And so in the early days of my career, I actually thought I was going to be an academic. That's the reason why I went to Florence, and then the reason why I went to Yale in international political economy. That at that time, Yale had a program that was in international political economy. And so areas that are between political science and economics and public policy and also public finance always interested me. But afterward, I went a different route, and I work in industry at Fiat, and after I moved to Goldman. And after I moved to Goldman, I realized that I did not know much about the history of finance, except that we Italians have always been convinced that banking was actually invented in Italy, and there is a grain of truth to it. Maybe it's not the whole truth, but there is something to be said about it. And so I started digging into that, and I have to tell you, my first big surprise. I knew about Venice. I've always been. I was born in a city that was only 60 miles from Venice, and so I've gone to Venice often. I knew Venetian history reasonably well, but when I opened the ledger of that small bank in Pisa, looking at the clarity with which the two bankers were registering the promises they were exchanging, I was just thunderstruck. I said, it's very difficult. It's odd for someone that works in one of the biggest investment banks, or not the biggest, but of the most well-known investment bank in the world, has to see a description of the essence of banking in an old 14th century ledger. And so I started looking for clarity, and after digging a little bit in the history of the Republic of Pisa, I found out that banking really took off when the mint was unable to mint more coins. And so it became clear that Pisa really two two kind of money. Had the had the coins from the mint and the promises of the bankers. And when the influx of metal, especially silver, dried out, the economy of Pisa that was blooming survived on bankers' promises. And so I start not only, but the transaction. Someone, you know it, bankers, especially investment bankers, the only thing they do is transaction. The thing they understand best is transaction. Now, disassembling and understanding the transaction as they were described in that old ledger was fascinating, and they were so clear. They were so conscious of what they were doing that they described it in an incredible way. And so that's how I got the idea. I say, okay, let's start now try to look at the transactions between banks and the states in totally different political system, in totally different areas, and try to see what the essence of the relationship between bankers and the state, the political system, is all about. You know, you've done it, and so you know it. Transactions have one feature: they don't lie. If you understand them and if you disassemble them into the main component, the goal of the partners and where they end up in achieving or maximizing their goals become starkly clear. And so you really understand what it's all about.
Well, there's some remarkably modern things about all of these historical moments. One of the things that I noticed, I remember reading the biography of Fisher Black, and according to that author, that was sort of when kind of the quants took over. But I mean, going back to Pisa, you had Fibonacci, right, who was not only a mathematician, but also, right, a banker, right, a guy who was writing.
A merchant. Actually, as you know, there are two theories about Fibonacci. Not two theories, two ways to look at the Liber Abaci. I still pronounce it as an Italian. Maybe it's Liber Abaci, but we say Abaci. Sweet I. One is that the essence of the book is a new mathematics, and that the examples from the world of business and finance are just because that was what he's doing for the living. Now, there is another view that is mostly supported by the financier and the bankers, which is exactly the opposite. That what he was really looking was at teaching merchants and bankers how to do transactions and how to evaluate, for instance, the time value of money and so on. And he used the new mathematics just to teach them to be better bankers, better financier, and better merchants. And if a mathematician looks at Liber Abaci, he sides with the first understanding. If a banker looks at Liber Abaci, he tends to sit with the second interpretation. But anyway, it's incredible to see in the same small city, Pisa had 25,000 people, in the same small city in 2 centuries, between 1200 and 1400, you see the new mathematics being introduced in the Western world, and bank money becoming the currency of the nation. It's incredible. I found it incredible.
Well, look, I mean, the entire system of finance is built on trust. And so it's about figuring out who is trustworthy and then making sure that the most trustworthy folks are the ones who are at the center of everything. And what I found astonishing about the Pisa story is that these ledgers were public, right? That people could observe them. They were transparent,
Yep.
and,
Yep.
Nowadays with all of this sort of obsession with distributed ledger technology and, Bitcoin and everything, that this idea of a public ledger that where everyone can see the interlocking obligations. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon at all. This predates, right? This goes back to the earliest days of banking.
They had two features. The first one was that they were public, and banking was transacted. The banker opened up his ledger, and the two parties, maybe not at the same time, but appeared in front of him. And the second was that the government was checking those ledgers. I mean, Venice had magistrates that were required to supervise the ledgers of the bank, the ledgers of the bankers, and they did supervise the ledger of the bankers. And the only place where you find those ledgers today are in the part of the archives that comes from those magistrates and from the Senate. And in the Banco Giro, which in my opinion was probably the first real public bank in the Western world, I cannot speak about the Eastern world and China, I don't know them well enough. The ledger was in two copies. One copy was kept by the man in charge of the ledger at the bank, and one copy was in the Senate. And they had to mirror each other, and they were entered at the same time. And the Senate could check every transaction, and the transactions in which the state was part of it needed to be authorized by the Senate. Mm-hmm. And the best way to reconstruct the transaction is you look at the decree of the Senate, and you see them being approved by the Senate and after being entered into the ledger. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's such a clarity. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is sometimes puzzling is why it is almost always the case that you have a separate entity, right, that is a quasi-private institution rather than simply an extension or branch of the state, right? So, you've got this guy, Vendramin, and I had never heard of this guy, and Patterson in England. I mean, I think he's somebody who, doesn't get enough kind of historical credit for creating this incredible institution, the Bank of England. But, I mean, even in the Soviet case, right, where you have this bank, which is sort of, I mean, it's clearly a branch of the state, but there is some independence in a way. I mean, it does seem puzzling. Why is it the case that we almost always need to have some separate institution that's distinct from the treasury, as opposed to simply having the governmental treasury manage all of these monetary affairs?
I'm not sure I can answer your. I'm not sure I can answer your question. I think that to a certain extent, it has something to do with what you mentioned at the beginning, which is trust. That splitting the whole business of banking between the entity that exchanging the promises and a higher authority that checks that everything is done well and correctly is is a reason. And I have to tell you that, in my opinion, the most clear example is the example of Venice. Because in a republic where private banking was that extensive, but you still had the magistrates in charge of checking the ledgers of the bank, the Senate is very clear. They did not want a bureaucrat to be the man that kept the books, the man that kept the ledger. They wanted a banker to keep the ledger, and they wanted the magistrate to check that the ledgers were well kept, and which I think it is very, very important. The man in charge of the ledger changed every 3 months. And at 3 months, he had to give a small notebook with a summary of the asset and the liabilities of the bank and the cash in coins that was in the coffer. And since they wanted to be totally transparent, all the liabilities, they have entered the name of the creditors. And so these small, there are 6 that have survived. These small ledgers that were given with the state of the bank from the exiting banker to the incoming banker, they actually give an incredible figure, because, Venice was small, no more than 100,000 people. They give an incredible picture of who really who really has received the promises to pay of the bank.
Mm-hmm.
Citizen and non-citizen, foreigners and citizen alike. And when Napoleon, just to tell you how smart Napoleon was or how good were his advisor, when Napoleon killed the Republic of Venice and conquered it and merged it into the Kingdom of Italy, he realized that those promises were public debt, because the bank was a branch of the state. And
Mm-hmm.
so he realized that the promises were public debt. And do you know what he did? Those became public debt of the Kingdom of Italy and were reimbursed. They were all paid.
Yeah. I mean, look,
And
the big part.
nobody of the creditor of the bank that had been practically killed lost anything.
Right. And I think what most people don't realize is that bank debts are, in effect, public debts, right? And that the banks themselves play this huge role in facilitating public finance. And of course, the countries that were able to get good, solid public finance were the ones that won all the wars. And of course, I was amazed at how Venice was able to ramp up its financing for these wars. And also, I had thought that Philip II was a guy who was, defaulting left and right, and it turns out that most of the people who loaned him money, I mean, they all got paid
money.
Sooner or later.
Not only, but they made plenty of money. They made plenty of money. Yes, few bankers went bust.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think that. Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the thing that attracted me, and the thing that attracted me immediately to the book is, it's hard for me not to buy a book that has tallies on the cover, because that is such an amazing institution that the English put together, going all the way back to the 12th century, and these
Yeah.
tallies were effectively, government obligations. And you discussed, I
Yeah.
think, it's one of the better treatments that I've seen, discussing how these tallies
Yeah, but
evolved.
do you know how it came about? That might give a little bit of lightness to this conversation, and so your listener will not get bored. Okay. So I I start reading about the Bank of Italy and Bank of England, sorry. And the beautiful thing about the Bank of England is that all the minutes of the court are online. And so I am sitting in my office in London at the Goldman office, or I am sitting in front of the computer at home, and I read the minutes of the court. And after I read some of the manuscripts of some of the debate on the origin of the Bank of England, and it's clear that there are all these promises being made, and I start to disassemble and reconstruct the first transaction. And so it is clear that the equity is paid in coins, okay? The equity is paid in coins. Not all of it, 50%. So they have raised 1.2 billion in equity, but in coins there is also a little over 600,000. So that's how you reserve to give liquidity to the promises of the bank. That's very clear and simple. The bank issues banknotes, clear. What are the assets of that bank? So I start looking for the assets, and my idea by looking at what was described is that the assets have got to be public debt, and public debt at the time in England was mostly tallies. So you won't believe this. I write the Bank of England an email, and I get a very polite and very quick reply, because I write them and I said, my understanding is that you should have tallies because the debt has never been repaid. The original debt has never been repaid. So the assets, a proof of the asset should still be. Do you know what the answer was? That tells you something that is totally English. The answer, they answered me in about a week and said, yes, we are ashamed to say that we have tallies in the vault of the museum, but they have all been put in a case during the Blitz in the Second World War, and we have not opened them. If you come, we will open it together. I jumped into a cab, I went in, and we opened it, and they were the tallies of the first transaction.
So you were the first one to see. I mean, that's crazy.
No, I was not the first one to see, and the Bank of England was so nice. Then they gave me they found that the keeper of the records has examined those tallies in the late 40s, and they gave me a copy of his notes.
Right. Now, of course,
but
that tells
you how, if you look at the transaction, everything becomes clear. Because you are a bank, you are a bank, and after you go to the record office, and you see the first page of the ledger, and there are the 5 tallies coming in, and the 800 bank notes going out. It's very clear. Is there in the first page. But the tallies were the asset, public debt. And for something like 10 years, all the assets of the Bank of England, not all of them, but most of the assets of the Bank of England were public debt. They were tallies.
Now, these things must have been pretty big, right? These were big ones.
One was 7'8" or 8'4". I don't remember. It's in the book. And there is a picture of the lady that opened the case with me, the curator of the museum, holding holding this stick, because the beautiful thing about England is that is this strange combination between innovation and tradition. And so they never change the way to cut the tallies. So when the tallies, when coins were the currency, and when the debt were for £3 or £2.20, the tallies was 5 inches long. But when every issue of public debt was £50,000, they didn't change the indent. They changed the length of the stick. So it became 7'8", 7'7", whatever.
Can you imagine if they
Marvelous.
still used these things?
Yeah, exactly what
Yeah.
it will be today. What it will be. You won't find it. You will have to
Goldman would
go and
have to
cut.
have like a
Exactly, exactly.
gigantic warehouse, right?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I
But
think it was a marvelous invention. And they use it to
yeah.
pay supplier to the state. When they
Well, I
didn't
love
have
how the
coin,
story.
they gave them tallies.
So maybe you can tell the story about how these things evolved, right? How they went from the soul to the pro tally, because that's a fantastic story.
At the beginning, the exchequer was divided in two. There was a lower exchequer and a higher exchequer. The lower exchequer received the coins from the tax collectors. The tax collector, that were mostly private people that did it for a fee, the tax collector collected the taxes in coin, and they brought the coin to the exchequer, to the lower exchequer. The lower exchequer, in exchange for the coin, gave them a tally that was a receipt of the coin received, and those coins were the revenues collected. Now, of course, the system would have lent itself to a lot of mismanagement, misappropriation, and everything. And so the higher exchequer kept his half of the tallies, and once a year they did a review, and they called the tax collector, and the tax collector have their half of the tallies, the higher exchequer have their own half, and they could see that nobody fooled around. And this was the first use of the tallies. But afterward, of course, it became clear that the tally, if you have the tally, you could go to the tax collector, give it to him, and get the coins. And so the tallies became a promise to pay by the exchequer. And that's where those became the tallies of Pro, because the tallies of Pro was, let's suppose that I am a wealthy lord. I loan coins to the state. The state gives me my half of the tally, and when by half of the tally is addressed to a revenue collector. So when the revenue collector collected the revenues, I go to him, give him my half of the tally, he gives me the coin, and my debt is reimbursed. When he's called to the review, he shows his half of the tallies that he has not appropriated the coin, and everything is marvelous system that lasted for 650 years or whatever. Marvelous system. So simple, so basic. A stick with dents
Yeah.
is a, is
Well,
a, is the foundation of public finance of the Kingdom of England.
it's a remarkable technology. I mean, I think we use this word technology in a limited fashion today to talk about, things that come from I guess, the natural sciences. But this really was a remarkable technology, which was the foundation for the strength of the British state and the British
Yes.
military, right? The ability to
Yeah.
go through and audit these accounts and to borrow money and have it
And
be
collect taxes
dependably
and
repaid.
collect taxes and collect taxes, all based on a stick.
Hmm.
So simple, so basic, so effect. In fact, it lasted for 700 years plus.
Right, and then of course the Neapolitan story is also fascinating, and I've been to Naples, and it's hard to, when you go to Naples, to believe that Naples was a place that had
Very
perfected
hard.
this
It was
very
hard.
orderly system.
It was hard for me, and I am an Italian, and I am really ashamed of myself because I should have known better. And I had before going to the archives of the bank, I had all the prejudices that Northern Italians has versus Neapolitan. I had them all, okay? And then I start I start reading, and the literature is so thin on these banks. It's so thin that really I could not make. If I try to reconstruct the transaction, I couldn't, because the secondary literature makes it very, very difficult. Not even going back to books of the 16th century, you find it. And so
But
I
the
went to
archival
the
resources are better than anywhere
250,
else, right?
200, and yeah, because there is a reason. What is surprising is that a city as messy as Naples was able to keep it. That's a surprising part. The not surprising part is that this system of bank debt, was a combination between a registered IOU and a banknote. And so when the bank was making promises, they were issuing these pledges of credit. But that pledges of credit, to be deposited on a bank account, had to be entered into a special ledger by bank employees. And when that pledge of credit was entered into the ledger, was returned, and all hundreds of years of pledges of credit are neatly stacked in the shelves. That's how you can find how much Caravaggio was paid for his painting. Isn't it amazing? With enough time and knowledge, you can find almost every sort of big transaction. I found a transaction in which the banks were subsidizing the Spanish Empire by buying silver at market rate, having minted it at a discount on the value of the silver as bullion on the world market, and being made in coin for the benefit of the Kingdom of Spain, that actually was part of the Spanish Empire. It's incredible. You can reconstruct the transaction and find out exactly how much money the banks lost to help the empire.
Well, I find it astonishing that
Amazing.
there was some bullion or coin which was being shipped from Spain to the Spanish Netherlands to wage war, and it was seized by the English, right, their
Yeah.
bitter enemy, and somehow these Neapolitans got it back with interest.
Yes.
you know,
But they
that's
didn't
pretty.
get back. They did not get back in coins. They got it back into bankers' promises through very complex arbitrage, by going through to areas in which the different price of the different currencies was traded. And so the two people that made this deal, they knew exactly which currencies were more valuable in the network of exchange markets in Europe, and they designed it in such a way that at the end the bankers got rewarded for letting giving the silver to Queen Elizabeth I. Amazing. They plotted it. If you read the paper, you can see they plotted it. And so they say, we go from here to Antwerp because if you have shilling from here to Antwerp that get converted into guilders, the arbitrage, you can make money. And then you go, and then you go from Antwerp to, let's take Lyon. And then you go from Lyon to Naples, and then you go from Naples to Medina del Campo, and so on. And since you make money at every place by arbitrage, you make enough to convince the Genoese banker to give their silver to Queen Elizabeth.
Now, when I teach my money and banking class, I always start off discussing the bill of exchange and how essential it was to the evolution of finance. And once you understand that part of the goal is to minimize the actual movement of money, right? It's kind of a pain in the butt to be moving money around, moving coins around, and so it's all about offsetting obligations. And the story of the écu de marque is one that I always find
Amazing.
fascinating.
Amazing.
And I think at one point, weren't they thinking about calling the common currency of the EU an écu instead of a euro?
No, it was called. Now, something that is not well known, and it is something that I learned at Fiat, the first common currency was private, almost private, and was called écu. And it was a combination of the various national currencies split by the size, or by a combination of the size of the economies and the public debt that was outstanding.
So
And
it was like the SD. It was like the SDR, right? The old
similar,
SDR.
similar.
Yeah.
But what happened was that the largest currency in the ECU was the German mark. And the Dutch guilder was very strong, and the French franc was very strong, and the Italian lira was also very strong. Not so much because the Italian lira was strong, but because the size of the Italian economy and the size of the Italian public debt was significant. And do you know what happened? I know because I worked at the first bond in ECU for Fiat in the early 80s. If you were a company, borrowing in ECU was cheaper than borrowing in Italian lira if you were an Italian company. So Fiat issued actually debt in ECU. And the name of the ECU was because some central bankers were cultured enough to know of the écu de marque. It's a story that is, people that are my age and that live through it, is a story that they know, but it has almost disappeared. Mm-hmm. That's where the name of the écu come from. Before being the euro, when was the écu? And that écu became, of course, private. Of course, only institutional investor issued debt in ECU. And especially for those currency that were weaker, and so it was cheaper issuing debt in ECU than issuing debt in your own national currency. That was the beginning of the common currency, and it could have been the beginning of the common debt. But The first part went fast, reasonably fast, and reasonably far. The second did not take off, and that's what the European. I know I'm preaching to the wrong, but that shows the areas in which the Continental Congress of the United States was much superior to the EU. The Continental Congress of the United States had common public debt before having a common currency. That I found is so marvelous, so innovative, and so great. They did not have a common currency, but they had common debt.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize that there were these, 13 separate currencies
For 10
floating around at
years,
the
for
time.
10 years, for 10 years, there was no mint. So the dollar was not minted, and it was converted into the shilling of each one of the 13 colonies. Yeah, but it was the debt of the Continental Congress. That's the incredible part. The debt was common, the currency was not. Amazing, marvelous. From what I know, and I might not know enough, it's unique in the world. Having common debt without having a common currency is the other way. The EU has gone the other way.
Yeah, I mean that history with Hamilton. I mean Hamilton was a visionary.
And
I mean
Morris.
he was
Yeah.
a really exceptional person who understood this.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't
but
know.
remember, the better banker was Robert Morris,
Yeah.
because if they have had the first Bank of North America on the Hamilton scheme, it would have failed because it would have been too big and it would not have enough coins to convert the unwanted dollar or the unwanted continental in coins. And Morris was so much of a good banker that he said, I know that I should have a bigger banker, but I can only have $400,000 in Spanish silver. And so the capital of the bank is going to be $400,000.
Now,
And he
where did
made
they
it
get these
solid.
ideas?
Here
I mean, they
at
weren't
here
reading.
at
They weren't reading. Galliani or. I mean, how did they? How did
no,
they
not
figure this
Galliani,
stuff
not
out?
Galliani, but they were reading, not Galliani, but they were reading, they were reading, they were reading in English, and Hamilton was reading Banking Classic, and so was Robert Morris. He had the pamphlet of the Bank of England with him. He knew it. He knew it exactly. Now, the surprising thing, if you want to go through, the book, is Marx, on the contrary, was reading everything, including Italian, and was reading Galliani. And his ideas about money and his ideas about banking are based on a lot of knowledge. The problem was that especially Lenin really didn't want to get an effective banking system, but he wanted to get a different kind of state, and he was convinced that if the Bolshevik controlled the bank, they would control the state.
Well, it's true. I mean,
It is true.
that's what.
That's what he
I mean,
did. That's what he did.
you seize the radio station and then you seize the banks, right?
Yeah.
The two things
Yeah, but he
that
was,
you want.
believe me, he was more concerned about the bank than the radio station, even because at that time in Russia, I don't think that too many people read the few papers that were circulating. So definitely, first thing, the
But
Duma,
I like.
which is the parliament, and the bank. Those were the first two moves. The Winter Palace and the bank, almost at the same time. Huh?
And he was reading this guy, Hilferding?
Yes.
I'd never heard of this guy.
The book is in English because I don't read German. The book is in English. I won't advise you to read it. It's boring. Actually, he might have been an incredibly smart man because he was a medical doctor, and after he became the Minister of Finances of the Weimar Republic, I think, but he didn't write well. He did not write well. But his idea of he looked mostly at the German experience. And the German experience at the time was all the industrial development has been financed with bank money. And so he got the idea right, mostly right, that if you control the bank, you can. He was a social democrat, huh? If you control the bank, you can control industry without expropriating the owners or the entrepreneurs. And so your best way to control the economy, the whole economy, is to control the bank or the banks. Now, Lenin understood this and he said, okay, if I leapfrog and the bank is controlled by the state, and even more, if I abolish money, and so instead of money, I have just the entries on the ledger, that's fine. The state controls everything, every transaction. The party controls the state, and I'm going to build communism. Great, huh?
Well, you described a story about this guy, Axelrod.
Yes.
I think in a microcosm, I think that story
you should read the
gives
book.
you some
You
sense
should
as to
read
why
the
you
book.
need money.
You should read the book because he was Swiss and he was an engineer. And a Swiss engineer is a very precise person. And when he realizes that what he has to go through to get the spare part, so he had to get authorization from one branch. The authorization is for being given a debt in the central ledger. And at the same time, the entity that in the north of Russia, not far from Siberia, he is building the spare part, has got to get from the central office the authorization to receive a credit in the ledger. Then they have to get the employees of the central bank or the equivalent of the central to enter the debt and the credit into the ledger. Then it's not finished. Now the railroad. The railroad have to get the debt and the credit in order to be allowed to ship it. And these also, so to get the spare part, it took 11 days.
Right, so the actual 60 rubles was a tiny fraction of the
yeah,
total cost.
yeah, 1,000 or something, exactly. And
Kind of like
Axelrod
working in a
went back to
large modern
Switzerland.
corporation, right?
No, or work, I did a stint when I did a stint in the collapsing Soviet Union. Actually, we had two ways. There was a saying that went around then. I'm not sure my Russian friend would like it. We were used to say there are two ways to get things done in Moscow. I traveled a little bit, but not very much. And we were used to say the two ways are red and green. Red is to go through the party and the bureaucracy. And green is to use dollars. If you go the red way, you won't get anywhere. If you go the green, you might get it what you want.
But it's kind of ironic that while Lenin believed that he could do away with money, and he thought of inflation as a good thing because it essentially undermined the utility of money, they ultimately wound up creating one of the hardest currencies in all of Europe, right?
He was
kept its value better than anybody else for a longer period of time.
Yeah, he was smart and he listened to those group of reformers. That's the only example that I know of two currencies. A nation having two currencies at the same time, and what happens is not that the bad one kills the good one, it's the other way around. It's that the bad one dies, that's good, the bad one dies, and the good one survives and becomes a national currency. It's the only example of violating the Gresham law. Of course, behind that there was incredible power of the incredible power of the not even the Soviet, of the Bolshevik state in the middle 20s, and when they wanted the reform were implemented, but they listened to these people. That's the part I found amazing. Now, one of the book of the reformers where he explained exactly what he did and how he did, it's translated in English. It's almost disappeared because it was translated in English when the new political economy was in vogue before Stalin, and the reformers were able to travel, and they were able to write in English because they spoke English and to be published in English. But that's is a 130, 140 page book, and you see exactly all the stages. Now, when Stalin came in, all the reformers were shot. But the books, if you look hard enough, you can buy in some used bookstore around the world, and I've done it. So, and it's amazing. It's amazing. It's an
Well,
amazing book.
over the years, I've taught financial history from time to time, and it does seem like the interest in financial history is highest when things aren't working, right? Like after the financial crisis, everybody took an interest in history, and then a few years later, they kind of lost interest. I mean, why do you suppose that is? I mean, you don't see financial history as a core class in any finance programs.
Not
Most
too
financial
much.
historians, most finance PhD students I know have very little understanding of the
Yeah.
origins of instruments that were, even ones that were invented just within the last couple decades. I mean, do you think that's I don't know, do you think they're missing out? I mean, do you think it's helpful for
I,
people to
I, s-
understand just a bit of the history to help them become better practitioners?
I think so. And actually, I have to tell you that there is right after the Silicon Valley Bank,
Yeah.
uh, there was an article. I don't remember who wrote it. I don't think it was Martin Wolf, but there was an article on the Financial Times that the article was based only the idea of the article, and he was quoting a lot, was this one. When things go well in finance, everybody talks abstract and theoretical. When things go back, they start talking history. And so when banks go bad, they start confronting that particular crisis with crises of the past. And depending on how good the financial history is, they go back in time. And so sometime is the crisis of the 29, sometime they go back to 1907 when the private bankers are headed by J.P. Morgan himself saved the banking system. Some go back even more, but the article was marvelous. Said until things go well, when things go well, is full of theoretical articles, formulas, and everything. And afterward, when things go bad, they start looking at the historical example. I won't argue that history teaches you, and if you read history well enough, you learn not to make mistakes, but it's helpful. I think it is very helpful, and so is in finance. But I know that you interviewed, that you had as a host here Will Gatesman, who is the reason why I spent 3 years at Yale when I was writing the book. And you know, Will is one of the best scholar in financial history, and his book is just marvelous. His book is just
Mhm.
marvelous. And we were discussing it. We are discussing it, and it's true. In when a crisis breaks up, people go and look at the previous banking crisis, and if they know enough, they go on the previous one, and if they know enough, they go to the previous one.
Mhm. Well, look, last question.
Yes.
You know, you didn't discuss this in the book, but I'm wondering, you start with Pisa and you start in the 1300s. Do you think it's a coincidence that these innovations began at the same time as all of these other wonderful things? You know, the humanists, right? I mean, Dante and Petrarch. Is there a connection in some way between the evolution of these trust-based institutions and the flourishing of arts and literature?
Possible. I don't know enough, but I have to tell you one thing, which go back to one article, one of the chapter in the book. Now, when I was in high school in Italy, I did a normal curriculum for a good high school student at the time, classical education. Okay, my math was pretty bad, but I was supposed to be able to translate from Italian to Latin and Greek and read them both. And at that time, one of the authors we were writing was Davanzati, Bernardo Davanzati. And we were reading him for the simple reason that he was one of the best translator of Roman classic. Okay? Now, before turning to translate the Roman classic in vernacular Italian, Davanzati did currency arbitrage in Lyon, and he spent 20, almost 20 years, was it 20 or 21, to write a 20-page essay that explained exactly how currency arbitrage worked in 16th century Europe. And so I don't know if what you say is correct, but if you look at Davanzati, who was an example of Italian polymath of the Renaissance, you find this, you know, someone that does currency arbitrage, and it is a polymath and writes on currency arbitrage, on making good wine, and translates Tacito. There got to be some connection. There got to be some connection. There got to be some connection. It's not the kind of person that you will. Not the kind of person that you will find doing all these things. Of course, he was exceptional, possibly, but definitely you could argue the same thing about a few others. So a few others.
Well, there
Look
were
at
some other folks like
go ahead.
Newton and Goethe
Yeah, Newton.
who dabbled in
Newton was
finance, right?
weighting coins, exactly, weighting coins.
Uh-huh.
When he became master of the mint, he spent his first years weighting coins because he wanted to know why silver coins in England left as soon as they were minted. Marvelous. His analysis of the coinage of all the competitors of England. That again is online because Oxford University has put it online. It's marvelous to read it, and you really get an idea of not only a theoretical genius, but a very practical genius. He weighted the coins, and he found that the British currency, undervalued silver. And so as soon as silver was coined, silver left England. Why? Because neither the French nor the Dutch coins undervalued silver. So the best way to make money was to go into England, buy coins, melt them, and go to the East, where the ratio silver-gold was 1 in 10 instead of 1 in 15. And you became rich. And that's exactly what the East India Company was doing, and they didn't like Newton.
Right. Well, I think you could do the
like
same
Newton
thing now
because
with
he showed exactly what they were doing.
I think if you wanted to now, you could do the same thing with U.S. pennies.
Probably, yeah.
Right. Well, look, Paolo, you're carrying on the tradition of
I don't know.
the
I wish
finance humanist with your book, Money and Promises. 7 deals that changed the world. Check it out. Lots of fun. I enjoyed reading it and hope to chat again soon.
Greg, it was a pleasure being with you, and you asked excellent questions. It's a pleasure to be interviewed by you. But Will told me. So, good evening.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.